Women do it too, but they haven't been encouraged from an early age to wear a complete lack of self-awareness as a badge of pride.
Robert Webb, you are blaming patriarchy for shaming men for having needs and talking about those needs, being self-indulgent. At the same time, as you're saying patriarchy is putting men's needs first. Which is it?
Complete lack of self-awareness.
Ahem. Excerpt from How Not to Be a Boy by Robert Webb. If you're thinking that this catalogue of mishandled feelings is in itself all a little bit self-indulgent, then I suppose my reply is this. For men of about my age and older, those whose fathers had fought in a war, or those who were raised by the sons of such fathers, there can be few more powerful accusations than the one of self-indulgence. Paul got it from Ron, and I got it from Paul. This is the voice I hear all the time. Be a man. Man up. Act like a man. Get a grip. Get real. Get over yourself. Pull yourself together. Sort yourself out. Stop moaning. Stop feeling sorry for yourself. You don't know you're born. Be a man. Man up. Act like a man.
Don't have needs.
It's no coincidence that this is the language frequently used by men who believe that we live in a feminized society, where men, particularly white men like themselves, have become the victims of discrimination.
Men victims of discrimination? Don't you understand the definition of the word man? Men have no vulnerabilities or needs, especially not in relation to women, who are entirely composed of vulnerabilities and needs.
Men's rights activists tend to make a series of valid observations from which they proceed to a single 180-degree wrong conclusion.
Conclusions like suicidal men avoiding going to counselors because they're afraid of the judgment of their deceased mothers and abusive ex-girlfriends?
They are correct to point out that worldwide suicide is the most common form of death for men under 50. It's also true that men are more likely than women to have serious problems with alcohol, that men die younger, and that the prison population is 95% male, and that the lack of support for our returning frontline soldiers is a national disgrace.
No argument.
So far, regrettably true. They are incorrect, however, to lay any this at the door of feminism, a term which they use almost interchangeably with women.
Most people who criticize the expectation that men put their needs last don't think feminists created the circumstances. But there definitely is a group of people who might be culpable of teaching men that their needs are shameful. And when one particular man is trying to struggle with his mental health needs, maybe it's a memory of that person that stopped him from going to a counselor. Of course not. That might make them victims. And men can't be victims of something because they're men. And men don't have needs or vulnerabilities. Self-awareness.
In my experience of reading the comments and replies to articles I've written on gender-related subjects, these are invariably the guys telling me to get a grip and act like a man.
Are you sure these are the same people? On the one hand, you're saying that they want you to man up and ignore your vulnerabilities. On the other hand, they're recognizing you are vulnerable as a man. I think you might have conflated some groups here. Your taxonomy seems inaccurate.
No, sir. No, lads. No, daddy. That won't help us, and it won't help anyone else. Men in trouble are often in trouble precisely because they are trying to get a grip and act like a man. We are at risk of suicide because the alternative is to ask for help, something we have been repeatedly told is unmanly. We are in prison because the traditional breadwinning expectations of manhood can't be met, or the pressure to conform is too great, or the option of violence has been frowned upon but implicitly sanctioned since we were children.
If the violence is sanctioned, implicitly or otherwise, why is the man in jail?
We die younger than women because, for one thing, we don't go to the doctor. We don't take ourselves too seriously. We don't want to be thought self-indulgent. The mark of a real man is being able to tolerate a chest infection for 3 months before laying off the smokes or asking for medicine.
Or taking time off from his job. I think that's the big one, Robert. The big kahuna of reasons why men don't take care of themselves. Makes a lot of sense when you consider that their identity is breadwinner.
Once in a long-term relationship, men are worse than women at maintaining same-sex friendships. I don't mean talking bollocks with the Gary in the pub, enjoyable as it is. I mean being able to tell Gary you've got cancer and expecting Gary to be able to listen. I'm not saying none of us have that kind of friend in our lives, but women seem to have about 4 each.
Robert, maybe the reason why men are expected to be breadwinners for women, they're expected to receive approval for getting that and to feel good about receiving approval for taking care of women. Maybe that's why they center their relationship on women. And you can't say the same for other men. You're not going to get that kind of approval from other men because you don't have this societal narrative in which you're expected to be a breadwinner for other men. Maybe that's why they focus on the relationships with women, because benefiting women is supposed to be where they get their sense of positive identity, not from other men. Interesting in our patriarchy that we've constructed it that way, but who am I to judge?
That's fine as long as your wife doesn't die or divorce you. If she does, men are left higher and drier not only because they relied on just one person for emotional support, but because they tend to be less plugged into the local community. If we do less of the school run, less of the shopping, less sitting in dentist rooms waiting with our kids, we aren't going to meet and get to know as many people, especially younger people. Loneliness is a man killer.
So women can avail themselves of the connections that keep them alive longer. I wonder who's making that possible for them.
Then there's work. Whether it's enjoyable, dangerous, repetitive, well-paid, badly paid, fulfilling, or soul-destroying, work-related stress is our problem, thank you. You women, please, hello there, please stop banging on the door and smacking your heads against glass ceilings in the attempt to compete or support. Shush, we got this. Oh shit, my ulcer, my tumour, the ulcer on my tumour.
How horrible men are, keeping women from working jobs that kill them with tumors and ulcers.
At least we have a job. When we don't have a job, fuck, I don't have a job. I'm not a man. My tumour, my ulcer.
Interesting how having work and being useful is synonymous with being a man. Having needs and indulging them is not.
Feminists didn't create these circumstances. Neither am I saying that men have gone along with this stuff like a bunch of passive idiots. I'm saying it's difficult to resist because it hides in plain sight. It's everywhere. A system of thought and invented and discriminatory practices in our laws, culture, and economy that feminists call the patriarchy. Feminists are not out to get us, they're out to get the patriarchy. They don't hate men. They hate the man.
Who is the man exactly? And what is his relationship to men?
The patriarchy was created for the convenience of men.
The patriarchy prevents women from working jobs that will kill them, tells men that they are self-indulgent if they put their needs first, compels men to provide for women as breadwinners, and shames them for asking for help. That is a summation of what you just said, Robert. It came from everything you wrote. I am not adding a thing.
The patriarchy was created for the convenience of men, but it comes at a heavy cost to ourselves and everyone else.
Complete lack of self-awareness.
To put it childishly, if you want a vision of masculinity, imagine Dr. Frankenstein being constantly bum-raped by his own monster while shouting, "I'm fine, everyone. I'm absolutely fine."
What part of what you described is convenient to men? In a social system that's supposedly all about providing men their needs over women's, men are shamed for asking for help or having needs.
I'm fine, I think to myself. The message that I get from Mags is that I've been selfish and self-indulgent. That's reasonable. Also, every now and again, I want to kill myself. No problem. The trouble is, there's someone whose only moral compass is the mother whom he believes, whom he has to believe, is watching over him, is going to find it difficult to walk into a shrink's office and demand to be listened to when he already thinks his mother is disgusted by his self-indulgence.
It's hard not to notice something here, Robert. It's not imaginary bad bros whose judgment is stopping you. It's your moms and your ex-girlfriend Mags. After your screed about patriarchy and Ron and Paul and get a grip and be a man and how feminism is helping you see the light, I expected you to tell us how you made the decision to go to see your school counselor, and just as you were about to walk through her door, your father spontaneously manifested in a cloud of toxic masculinity, throwing off electricity bolts made from patriarchal fury and evil, and slapped you about the head and neck while screaming, "No boy of mine, and who's a pretty boy, who's a pretty boy, who's a pretty boy?" But no, that entire chapter was building to the payoff.
Complete lack of self-awareness.
Your fear of your mom and your girlfriend shaming you for having needs stopped you from going to the doctor. You built up this patriarchal monster, and then it had a female face. Does that make sense to anyone?
Complete lack of self-awareness as a badge of pride.
This is broken thinking. The idea that women hold power over men, in particular their identities, men's identities, is possibly the most fraught, psychologically fraught concept in our world. And when I say hold power, I mean that they actually do hold power. Not that it's okay in some far-off magical fantasy land that could never possibly exist, full of unicorns and fairy farts, for women to hold power over men. But, like I said, that doesn't exist. It's impossible. This concept is so psychologically fraught that I think it's spawned a phobia, an entire fucking ideology based on a phobia of even recognizing that the control exists.
Badge of pride.
I have a phobic disorder, or did. In my case, my phobia was very specifically about vomiting in public. I recognize the symptoms of the broken thinking around phobia. I don't know if you'll ever watch this, Robert, but I'm telling you something very personal. My phobia is sort of freaking ridiculous, isn't it? Well, for me, it represents being vulnerable and being humiliated by that vulnerability, because I convinced myself that I would be judged harshly if I was sick. In fact, I convinced myself I would be judged harshly if I even breathed a word about being afraid of being sick in public. So I suffered with it in silence for 23 years. Eventually, my fear got so bad, I stopped leaving my house. You're probably wondering how this relates to you, Robert. You have the same fear. You're afraid of your vulnerabilities, and you're afraid of admitting you're afraid. In my case, I escaped into a cage that I had complete control over, my own home. Sometimes my home wasn't safe enough, and I boxed myself into a single room. In your case, your fear is buttressed by an entire ideological belief system known as feminism. You don't have to face the reality of women's control over your life because you can escape into a mythology of your own power. Patriarchy. Now imagine if I went to a therapist and he told me the following when I explained my fear of vomiting in public. Yes, Allison. Only horrible people fear vomiting in public. You should never talk about this fear because you have to recognize that you have complete power over vomiting. And if you ever do vomit in public, it's because you chose to be an awful person to others. This would be malpractice. I don't have ultimate control because no one can be absolutely sure that they will never vomit in public. And making me out to be a bad person for having the fear unless I deny the truth of both my fear and the power that people actually do hold over me when I'm vulnerable is some disturbed 18th century version of therapy that doesn't belong in a modern society, Robert. Look at what you've written. Look at the people whose judgment you fear. That's what's keeping you from getting your mental health needs met.
He thinks his mother is disgusted by his self-indulgence.
This is what feminism is saying in response to men's fears about women's judgment. Fears that kept you, Robert, from seeking help. Once again, yes, Robert, only horrible people fear women's judgment. You should never talk about this fear because you have to recognize that you have complete power over women, and if you ever are judged, it's because you chose to be an awful person to them. The feminist approach to men's mental health doesn't belong in modern society. You don't have control over women's judgment, Robert, and some women, like your abusive ex-girlfriend Mags, will judge you harshly. You're not a bad person for being afraid of women's judgment either. Believing in feminist conjecture will only serve to strengthen the power that fear holds over your life, because the only way to escape a fear is not to pretend what's making you afraid doesn't exist, but to build up your ability to cope with the fact that it does. It says, yes, your abusive ex-girlfriend will judge you for having needs, and for whatever reason you believe your deceased mother will too. And it's understandable to fear their judgments and recognize they exert a powerful influence over your mental health as a man. Instead, feminists allow men to escape from their fear into a seductive fantasy land where women's control over their lives doesn't exist. But that fantasy land is just that, a fantasy. I'm sure it feels like feminism is doing something good for you, Robert. It was sure a relief for me when I could run away from the world into my home. run away from my fear and take all that pressure off. But my inability to face my fear was what ultimately caged me in a box. Nothing based on feminist patriarchy conjecture can be therapeutic for men. Robert is a perfect example of that.
Complete lack of self-awareness as a badge of pride.
The truth remains the truth, and you, Robert, remain unable to cope with your fear of women's judgment. And if therapy isn't teaching you how to cope, it isn't therapy. My therapist, luckily, gave me the tools to face my fears, but he never let me run from them, because that wouldn't be therapy. Right now, there are a lot of men doing exactly what Robert is doing, running from their fear of recognizing women's control into narratives of power. They might use the word cuck, or male privilege, or pussy whipped, or patriarchy, but they're all doing the same thing, running. Except one group, ironically, the one Robert chose to single out for his 2 pages of polite critique. Robert says, "They are incorrect, however, to lay any of this at the door of feminism." We are incorrect to lay any of this at the door of feminism. A friend of mine is taking a master's of counseling. Many of you will know her from her YouTube channel, The Prim Reaper. In one of her books that she's currently reading to take her master's, there are various chapters covering different mental health modalities. These therapies cover all sorts of approaches. One focuses on unconditional positive regard, another on cognitive behavioral therapy, another on psychoanalysis, and on and on. But all of these different modalities share one thing in common. They center the patient and his process of healing. Except for one. That one talks about using the patient and his mental health struggle to further the goal of spreading an ideology. I'll let you guess the ideology that presumes to put its fingers in people's skulls and fuck around with the insides. Men suffering from mental health issues are not feminism's playthings or tools or pawns. Now, the rest of this isn't addressed to Robert, but to those who are destroying men's mental health and well-being under the guise of helping them, namely people who promote mental health modalities for men that encourage them to run away from their fears into nonsense ideologies and call it therapy. You are charlatans. You are doing the equivalent of taking a girl with a phobic disorder and teaching her she is a bad person for having it and telling her the only way to manage it is to believe your snake oil. And I see through it. You are using men's fear of women's disapproval to perpetuate an ideological belief system. Like Robert, they can pretend it's really other men to blame for shaming their needs, even as they fear and literally say that they are not getting their needs met because they're afraid of being shamed by women. You got men addicted to this bullshit and spinning the wheels of political power for you. Male feminists talk about all the men who use cock and pussy whipped and control your woman. But how are they any different when the sum total of their fear of recognizing women's power is the engine driving a multi-billion-dollar industry and a gigantic political movement along with a metric fuckton of farcical intellectual fart sniffing? But this entire smokescreen and smoke and mirrors narrative, this entire smoke and mirrors narrative has an Achilles heel. Me and other women like me. What if I disapprove of patriarchy conjecture? What if I say it's a lazy way for men like Robert to avoid the one thing they fear most, acknowledging that women have any power over them? In order to stop me, you'd have to play your hand and admit this power exists. But you won't, because the only way your narrative works is if you hide the truth like sleight-of-hand haze artists you are. You know what I see when I look at men? I see people struggling with the same kind of phobia I had for 25 years, the same pain, humiliation, and fear, and being fed on by ideologues. But guess what? I figured my way out of the maze. And what if I take my ball of golden string and give men a way out too? What are you going to do to stop me? Disapprove of me? I'm a woman. Not just that. I'm a woman who's liquefied a panic disorder from within, so don't bother trying to catch me in your net of fear-mongering lies about society's war on women. You might as well throw a bucket of water on a duck. Oh, and Robert, did you imagine that this would be the men's rights response?
Women do it too, but they haven't been encouraged from an early age to wear a complete lack of self-awareness as a badge of pride.
All right, it's time. I'm going to offer a proposal for those of you listening, and if you don't want to be proposed to, please click away now. Shoot, this isn't for you. We good? We ready to be proposed to? Excellent. Speaking of men who aren't running away, I'd like to thank our patrons and supporters for making it possible to talk about these issues in the way that we do, and offer most of our content for free. Our patrons and supporters are doing the heavy liftings, folks. Not just for Honey Badger Radio, but for a future in which men like Robert can actually face their fears, forgive themselves, and do some real muscular healing. So if you want to join their generous and illustrious ranks, please direct your browsers to the link here. Did it? Yay! Winning. That will take you to www.feedthebadger.com. And if you enjoyed this video and want a bit extra, I've put up some patron-only outtakes. To access that, go to here, www.patreon.com/honeybadgerradio. It's up to us to do this because, as you can see, the people dominating the discourse are incapable of any kind of self-awareness. And I plan to take my skein of golden yarn and make this maze make sense. Is it skein? 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 Skein. I think it's skein.